the latest sport news, the legendary Lotus name has just withdrawn from Formula 1. This marks the end of an era for this much-loved motor racing icon. And that's it for today's...
Some people say that dreams cannot be built, that you can't make a racing team in 5 months and a car in 3, that we'd never start, never finish, never compete. Some people believe that dreams never come true.
This is, without doubt, one of the most controversial cars in the modern history of Formula 1, yet it is almost always overlooked. It was designed in record time, it never scored any points, but almost everything about it seemed controversial. The bodywork, the team's entry into Formula 1 itself, even its name were matters of dispute. 2 years after the car's racing life had ended, its design was still being argued over in court, and it was alleged that its design had essentially been stolen from another team. This is the somewhat unlikely story of the Lotus T127. Formula 1 was in a state of crisis in 2009. There were talks of a breakaway championship and the FIA was at war with the teams. And in the midst of all of this, the FIA opened up the entry list for the World Championship in 2010 to brand new teams. And one of these prospective teams was the Litespeed Formula 3 team. Litespeed had been set up by former Lotus engineer Steve Kenchington in 2008, and it contested the national class of the British F3 Championship using the old SLC R1 Formula 3 cars. When the entry list was opened up by the FIA, Litespeed applied to enter Formula 1. It would have been a huge leap from the second tier class of British Formula 3 right into the Formula 1 World Championship. At that point, new teams in Formula 1 believed that they would be racing under a $30 to $40 million cost cap, although that idea was eventually dropped. We'll have to get back to that. The new team, though, would not have raced under the Litespeed brand. Instead, Kenchington had agreed a license to use the Team Lotus brand, last seen in Formula 1 in 1995 with the Pacific Grand Prix team. Team Lotus itself had closed its doors at the end of the 1994 season, with an unraced design for 1995 already in the wind tunnel. Litespeed had only ever done a new engine installation on a Formula 3 car. It had never designed a car, let alone a Grand Prix car. So Kenchington turned to respected Formula 1 engineer Mike Gascoigne to create a new car for this new team. By this point, it was the spring of 2009, barely 9 months before any new car would need to start testing. But at this point, Litespeed had no car design, no factory, and no entry into the World Championship. So Gascoigne started some initial work on a car design in his office in Germany, but he later admitted that this work was little more than a deep investigation into the new for 2010 technical regulations, which would see refueling band and new narrower front wheels and tyres fitted to the cars. This would mean that a 2010 car would need a much longer wheelbase than a 2009 car. Gascoigne's work on the new Litespeed Lotus car didn't actually get very far, as in June 2009 it was revealed that the team had not been granted an entry into Formula 1. This was largely because, according to those involved at least, that there was very little money behind the project overall. The story really should have ended here, but it didn't. Shortly after the 2010 entry list was announced, the FIA contacted a number of the unsuccessful applicants and asked them to remain ready to move forward with their applications if one of the existing teams dropped out. The suggestion being that the FIA wasn't confident that all of the teams on the F1 entry list would make it. And one of the existing teams did drop out a few weeks later. BMW announced that it was quitting Formula 1, and that would open up a slot on the grid, and a number of the teams would again apply for an entry. The FIA's subsequent announcement of the team which had secured that entry was something of a surprise. It was announced as being the Lotus F1 team. No, not that one, that comes a lot later. Instead, this was the Litespeed Formula 3 team in its F1 guise. The Litespeed name, though, no longer appeared on the entry. Instead, the parent organisation of the Lotus team was listed as the One Malaysia Racing Team, a new organisation founded by airline entrepreneur Tony Fernandez. It turns out that Fernandez had got involved with the team as a title sponsor, but ended up owning the whole thing. The Lotus F1 team name didn't stick. Team Lotus was not used either, and the team was quickly rebranded into Lotus Racing. This rebrand was done with the express permission of Proton, the Malaysian car manufacturer which owned Lotus at the time. It also sponsored the new team. This second entry procedure following the departure of BMW started in late July 2009, and the Litespeed organisation, or One Malaysia Racing as it now was informed that its entry was granted in September, and that left hardly any time for the team to get up and running, let alone design a car. However, Fernandez had offered Gascoigne some basic funding to get a car design underway in July 2009 before the entry was confirmed, and that's what he did, even though he had extremely limited time and resources. It's worth noting here that at this point other teams were far more advanced with their 2010 designs. Notably, Dallara had finished, built and crash tested its first 2010 chassis for the new Campos Meta team, later rebranded as Hispania and HRT, about 6 to 8 weeks after Gascoigne and his tiny group of engineers in Germany had just started to design the new Lotus. They were simply months behind the pack. Curiously, in Malaysia, the entry of the new team into Formula One was reported very differently. The Lotus name was a lot less prominent, but the One Malaysia Racing brand was all over the place. At an event, a model was shown of a Formula One style car with a rather wild livery on it. At that event where it was shown off, the Finance Minister of Malaysia also announced that the new car would be built in Malaysia by a Malaysian team, and the drivers and pit crew would also be Malaysian. This obviously wasn't correct, but later the team stated that they wanted to build a technical centre at the Sepang circuit in Malaysia, but they can also confirm that the Lotus would actually be built in Norfolk, England. The new team had acquired the old Racing Technology Norfolk factory in Hingham, England, very close to the main Lotus factory at Heffel. This old RTN building had produced the 2003 Le Mans winning Bentley as well as the Audi R8C. But despite this success in sports car racing, the building was actually designed and constructed specifically for Formula One, and in a roundabout way it was built for Toyota. Japanese company Tachi Oiwa Motorsport, better known as TOMS, asked former Formula One driver Hiroshi Fushida to open up a UK subsidiary to enter initially Formula 3 and later Formula 1. The Formula 1 car was actually designed and a promotional model of it was produced, though not, as sometimes stated, a wind tunnel model. However, Toyota declined to enter F1 at that point, opting for a sports car project instead. So the new Lotus F1 car would finally see the building used for what it was designed for. However, the new car wasn't actually designed in Norfolk, and the chassis wasn't made there either. As to save time, both of those jobs were actually being done in Germany, with not a little bit of Italian input as well. Gascoigne had pulled together a small team of engineers in Cologne, Germany, with some former Toyota F1 team members joining him there. There was also substantial input from the Fondtech organisation in Italy, which was tasked with building the first wind tunnel model of the new Lotus. That company would go on to play a critical role in the car's development, but also a critical role in the controversies that followed. Meanwhile, for Gascoigne, the choice of engine and gearbox wasn't really a choice at all. The FIA had insisted, albeit unofficially, that every new team must use the Cosworth CA V8 engine and the new Xtrac P1044 transmission. This wasn't really a problem for Gascoigne, as both parts were readily available by that point, and that's exactly what the new team needed. A Lotus Cosworth, of course, had a very nice ring to it. It brought up memories of the famous Lotus 49 and later projects like the Lotus 72. The Cosworth CA was a normally aspirated 2.4 litre V8 engine with port injection. It was first used in Formula 1 in the 2006 season, fitted to the Williams FW28, and it was a continuation continuation of the concept used in the 3-litre TJ engine, which lived on in air-restricted form in the back of the Toro Rosso STR1 in 2006, itself a modified Red Bull RB1. We'll probably have to get back to that. It was considered in general to be a decent engine, and the first F1 unit to hit 20,000 RPM, first on the dyno and later on the racetrack. However, the engine fell from favour and it was only used for a single season. Williams switched to Toyota power for the 2007 car. Cosworth then was out of Formula 1, but that break was temporary, as the new teams in 2010 would all be using Cosworth power, as well as the Williams team once again. The CA engine had to be reworked extensively to meet the demands of the 2010 technical regulations. Actually, when that work began, there were even some suggestions that the Cosworth engine would be used by the entire field in Formula 1. This was part of the long-running dispute between the FIA and the teams, and that was the situation when work on the 2010 version of the CA began, though a Ferrari Cosworth or a Honda Cosworth, well, it seems unthinkable, doesn't it? By 2010, the rules had changed compared to 2006, and a rev limit was now in place. Rather than revving at over 20,000 RPM, the Cosworth V8 and every other engine in Formula 1 would be restricted to 18,000 RPM. Meanwhile, the engine would need to be a lot more robust than it had been in 2006. In 2006, the engines would be changed after about 1,200 kilometres of running, but by 2010, engine life had been extended by the FIA, and each unit would need to last about 2,200 kilometres. Later, Cosworth realised that the cylinder heads of the CA could actually last much beyond that mileage, but the blocks couldn't. Fuel efficiency was also much more critical in 2010 than it had been in 2006, and this was due to the refuelling ban. The less fuel a car had to run in the tank, the lighter it could be throughout the race. Fuel efficiency then equaled on-track performance. Another key change for the CA for 2010 was made to the cylinder heads, where the mounting points to the chassis were found to be less than ideal on the 2006 version of the engine, so these had to be reworked for the 2010 specification. Remember, on a Formula 1 car, the engine is fully stressed, meaning it carries all of the chassis loads through the car. The lower mounts of the engine and the mounts at the rear were also revised to improve the stiffness of the car and the engine overall. The new 2010 version of the Cosworth engine proved to be very reliable, but with approximately 733 brake horsepower, it was no longer the most powerful unit in Formula 1. The gearbox on the Lotus, as I mentioned, was the new off-the-shelf Xtrac P1044 transmission. The casing of this gearbox, seen here, was mostly designed around the demands of the Dallara design team who were working on the F110 car, which would ultimately be used by the Hispania team. Lotus arrived so late to Formula 1 that it could have no influence on the casing's design at all, and simply had to use the pickup points that were on the transmission, those that were designed around a different car. So they didn't exactly suit what Gascoigne and the Lotus team really wanted to do, but they had to accept them for time's sake and try to make the best they could with the external geometry and the uprights. As the Lotus car was developed through the 2010 season, a bespoke gearbox casing was considered to revise the whole rear end of the car, but it was felt to be too expensive and complex for a part season's use. The engine and the gearbox were actually the first parts of the new car to be delivered to the factory, even before the monocoque design was finalised and mocked up. Many people in Formula 1 were stunned at how fast the Lotus project was moving, and by October the team was able to reveal pictures of its wind tunnel model awaiting its first runs. The car design revealed in those pictures was extremely conventional, with double wishbone suspension all round with pushrod actuated torsion bars front and rear. While the front wing looked a little bit basic, as in fact did the entire design, the car would develop quite rapidly. The progress of the project and the car design was quite literally incredible. As later wind tunnel model images showed, the design progressed quite rapidly. Extensive CFD work was also well underway on the car. Notably, of the 3 new teams in 2010, only 2 of those new teams were using wind tunnels to develop their cars. The Virgin Racing team was taking a CFD-only approach to its car design, and by the time the Lotus was being developed, well, there was no development on the HRT at all. As the aerodynamic development progressed on the design, the first parts of the actual cars were being designed and built, with the composites work being conducted by the Capricorn company in Germany, who were responsible for manufacturing the first chassis, the monocoques. And with the first chassis completed, crash testing was undertaken and duly passed, a key stage for any car's development. Any delay here, though, would have meant missing the first race. So I suspect that the design of the new Lotus chassis was a little bit conservative. Once all of the car parts were designed and constructed, assembly on the first chassis began in Norfolk, and once the car was finally all together, the first chassis was shaken down at Silverstone in its traditional green with yellow striped Lotus livery. At the wheel was indeed a Malaysian driver, Faraz Fauzi, though he would not actually take part in the 2010 season as a race driver for the team. Following the shakedown, the team shipped the car to London for it and the team's official launch, and here the car was given its formal name, the Lotus Type 127, or T127 for short. It was an official Lotus chassis designation or type number. We'll come back to that. Notably, the team's race drivers were both former Grand Prix winners, something that neither of the other two new teams could boast. It showed just how serious this new team was. The Lotus was ready for the first race of the 2010 Formula 1 season, and it's fair to say that neither of the other new teams were ready for that first race. The Hispanias arrived in Bahrain with their cars as piles of component parts, and the Virgins, which had been built and testing long before the Lotus was finished, were revealed to have fuel tanks that were too small to allow the cars to actually finish the Grand Prix. Lotus had also struggled with sizing its fuel tank, claiming that the consumption data from Cosworth was a little bit unclear. However, it did manage to get it right, unlike the other two new teams. The HRT also had problems in that respect as well. Here you can see the complex task of fitting the ATL fuel cell into the first T127 monocoque. It's not an easy job at all, and not one you want to repeat, yet both HRT and Virgin had to redesign and refit their fuel tanks. Both Lotus T127s finished on their debut, while none of the other new teams' cars finished at all. Over the season, the T127 proved to be generally slightly faster than the Virgin design, but there were some tight battles in qualifying which were quite entertaining to watch, though the Lotus generally outraced the Virgin. The HRT, with no technical development on it whatsoever, was never really a match for the Lotus. However, the Lotus was never really a match for everybody else. It just wasn't really fast enough on pure pace to match the established teams. Its rushed development meant that it just lacked downforce overall. Additionally, a lot of the parts of the T127 were quickly found to be over-engineered and a bit too heavy. The uprights, for example. This was a deliberate choice in the car's design, however, as the team couldn't afford any failures early in the season, as it wouldn't be able to replace them quickly. But later in the year, lighter versions of the uprights were introduced. It was a similar story for some of the suspension parts, where titanium arms were used instead of composite parts. But again, this was done for reliability and simply to get the cars ready for the start of the season. And again, these were replaced during the year with lighter elements. The inboard suspension was also improved during the season quite significantly, with new dampers being fitted along with a Cambridge inerter, while a centre of gravity rig was used to better understand the car overall. The initial design of the brake ducts on the car were found to be oversized as well. Smaller, more efficient versions were introduced as the season went on, along with a number of other significant aerodynamic upgrades, including a new diffuser, revised barge boards, and a new front wing. However, at the start of the season, the team also struggled to meet the weight limit, and this restricted some aerodynamic development projects, like developing a blown diffuser or an F-duct. Additionally, the team didn't have access to exhaust gas simulation at first, meaning that developing a blown diffuser would have been a massive challenge. And speaking of massive challenges, a major mechanical upgrade package was introduced at the British Grand Prix, and that reduced the car weight by 12.5 kilograms. The rear bodywork alone was reduced by 1.5 kilograms. This upgrade package and weight reduction got the car under the weight limit for the first time and gave the team a bit more freedom on tuning the weight distribution of the vehicle overall. The T127 had its best ever finish of 12th position at the 2010 Japanese Grand Prix, which along with some other strong finishes secured Lotus Racing in 10th position in the Constructors' Championship. Crucially, that's where the prize money starts to be paid out. The car had done its job, but the arguing over the car's design and many other aspects was far from over. The car was controversial before it had even turned a wheel. In fact, before it had even been built, the controversy around the T127 had started. When Lotus Racing first revealed a couple of pictures of the T127 wind tunnel model in October 2009, some people who saw those photos felt that the design looked a bit familiar. In fact, a bit too familiar. An engineer at the Force India team looking at the pictures recognised his own handwriting on the wheels of the wind tunnel model. It was clear to him right away, and then the Force India senior management, that the new Lotus wind tunnel model was using some of the wheels from the Force India VJM02 2009 car wind tunnel model. In fact, it's clear to see that from some angles the T127 design did in fact look an awful lot like the VJM02. It was also worth noting that both the VJM02 and the T127 were being developed at the same wind tunnel Aerolab in Italy, as well as the jointly operated Fondtech wind tunnel. Additionally, Mike Gascoigne had worked for Force India until late 2008, where there was a rather acrimonious parting of ways. So he was already very familiar with the VJM02 design, and as soon as the Lotus project was given the green light for actual car design and development by Fernandez, Gascoigne contacted Fondtech about not only the use of their wind tunnel, but also the assistance with the design of the wind tunnel model and some of the new car's aerodynamic surfaces. Lotus Racing actually ended up with a twin wind tunnel approach, working in both the Fondtech and Aerolab wind tunnels, both using 50% scale models. It was a much better situation than Gascoigne had originally expected, and the reason for this is that the Aerolab tunnel was unexpectedly available. Gascoigne was under the impression that Force India was using Aerolab and only the Fondtech tunnel was available to him. However, Force India had been in dispute with the Aerolab management, and essentially Force India hadn't been paying its bills. Tunnel time at Aerolab was billed to Force India at just over €250,000 per month, and the team had fallen so far behind on its payments that the wind tunnel staff had stopped work on the VJM02 altogether, and they'd boxed up all of the wind tunnel model parts, put them in a corner, to be returned to the Force India team once those bills had been paid. So Gascoigne was able to take up the suddenly available wind tunnel time with his new T127 project. However, the rush to get the T127 designed resulted in engineers at Fondtech and Aerolab cutting some substantial corners, and rather than designing everything from scratch, they looked to see what was around them. The boss of the company, Jean-Claude Migeot, had told the staff not to invent anything new with the T127, and by this he meant not to try to make the car full of innovative new parts, but rather just a conventional design that would work. But some of the staff misunderstood this instruction of don't invent anything, and they believed he meant to use existing designs that they had access to, and those designs would have all come from the VJM02. In the effort to advance the project, the first wind tunnel model was built, but Lotus had not supplied the 2010 specification wind tunnel model wheels and tyres, which of course were essential to any testing. These would have been supplied by Bridgestone, but they hadn't yet arrived. To show that the model was largely ready for testing, the staff at the wind tunnel sent Mike Gascoigne some pictures of the model in the workshop, but without the wheels and tyres ready to be put onto the car, they simply used the Force India parts from the storeroom and rested them up against the car. These pictures were never intended for publication, and had they not been published, nobody would ever really been aware of the growing scandal which resulted around the T127's design. However, once those pictures were taken, the wheels were then properly mounted onto the model, and the initial wind tunnel tests on the T127 began using Force India's wheels. Gascoigne later admitted to knowing that the car was testing in the wind tunnel using the Force India wheels. While this wasn't really the correct thing to do, it also wasn't exactly stealing any design secrets. The shape of the 2009 wheels and tyres were not a secret at all, and they were Bridgestone and BBS's IP and not of any particular team. They were also the wrong shape for the 2010 car anyway, so they were fitted just as a shortcut to get the test program started. It later turned out, though, that these were not the only Force India parts fitted to the model, or indeed included in the overall design of the T127. Force India later lodged a formal legal complaint about the T127's design, which took until early 2012 to actually come to court, long after the T127 had been retired. Indeed, the Lotus team by this point was known as Caterham F1. After hearing the case, the court found that the early season T127 in 2010 had in fact used parts of the VJM02 in its design, including the front wing, the vortex generators, the rear wing central section, some rear brake duct elements, and the complete rear view mirror design. These all came directly from the VJM02 design. It also found that other parts used on the car were based on designs which used aspects of the Force India CAD model as their starting point, rather than being designed from scratch. The initial brake duct design, for example, was taken directly from the VJM02 in the wind tunnel model and then further developed. The rear wing concept was also taken from the Force India, but the final design did have some important differences to the Force India. The Lotus wing was end plate mounted, for example, while the Force India wing was pillar mounted. In fact, the engineers at Aerolab and Fontech actually used the VJM02's aerodynamic performance figures to set targets for the T127. Other parts of the car also seem to have their origin in Force India parts. Elements of the front brake ducts, the diffuser, and some other developmental parts which were never actually fitted to the VJM02 were also used on the Lotus. So as a result of all of this, the court found that yes, some of the T127's design had indeed been directly taken from Force India, but they also found that this was not a case of systematic copying. As a result of this copying, it ordered that Aerolab owed damages of €25,000 to the Force India team, but it also found that Force India still owed Aerolab over €800,000, so the damages would just reduce the outstanding debt. However, the court also essentially exonerated Mike Gascoigne and the Lotus Racing team and ordered Force India to pay them £650,000 in legal costs. Yep, that's right, the T127 used copied Force India parts without permission, and Force India had to pay Lotus Racing hundreds of thousands in legal fees. The Force India team were obviously not especially happy about this situation, with Deputy Team Principal Bob Fernley telling the media that the judge clearly felt that Force India fell short of proving systematic copying, but in the judgment it's made clear that Caterham and Aerolab copied elements of subsystems related to the front and rear brake duct systems, the front wing, the rear wing, the barge boards, the vortex generators, and the diffuser. So what bit of systematic copying is missing? Curiously, the FIA never seemed to take much interest in this case, which seems ironic when you think that a decade later, the Force India team, by then known as Racing Point, was caught up in its own copying scandal when it was accused of copying the 2019 Mercedes W10 to use as the basis of the Racing Point RP20. The team obviously did copy the aerodynamic design and concept of the Mercedes, which in itself isn't strictly against the rules. Every team copies each other to some degree, using photographs and publicly available documentation and simply looking at their rivals' cars. However, Racing Point was also found to have directly copied the Mercedes brake ducts using the Mercedes CAD models. As a result of this, Racing Point was fined €400,000 and had some crucial Constructors' Championship points docked from them at the end of the season, and this saw them fall one position in the Constructors' Championship, which in terms of prize money was probably a multi-million euro impact. While the rules had changed slightly since the T127 and Force India scandal, the outcome was just wildly different, wasn't it? Interestingly, in the T127 case, the judge found that the overall shape of the 2010 Lotus was largely based on that of the Force India, a sentiment which can be found in his judgment. I conclude that Mr. Mijo intended his staff to take as their starting point the design of the Force India car at the level of the general shape and configuration of its component parts, but no more. That explains why, as counsel for Force India emphasised, there is no record of Aerolab and Fontech having carried out any initial work on the overall design of the model before plunging into the designs of the individual parts, and there is relatively little evidence of any overall direction of the project so far as the design of the model was concerned, particularly during the initial stages. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the T127 in its launch specification and compare it with the VJM02 in its launch specification. And from the outset, there is a clear resemblance between the two at the front end. They both have a similar shaped nose and front wing support, but you'll probably notice that in the launch specification, the Force India front wing looks nothing like that of the Lotus. However, if you look at a later iteration of the VJM02 front wing, then the similarity with the T127 front front wing is undeniable. Some aspects like the end plates and the front wing main plane look essentially identical, while some of the smaller elements are slightly different but clearly follow the exact same concept. The roll hoop shape is similar as well, although the Lotus didn't use remote supports and the Force India did. From dead ahead as well, the rear wings also look identical. Rotate the cars slightly though, and the similarities start to drop away between the two designs. The twin support pylons on the rear wing of the Force India are absent on the T127, and the Force India's heavily sculpted sidepod shape is dramatically different to the rather boxy arrangement of the Lotus. In reality, the T127 could never have been a direct clone of the VJMO2. The two cars used different engines, different gearboxes, and were built to different rulebooks, meaning that the Lotus was a longer car, but while the two cars are different, it's clear that their designs are somewhat entwined. One question that dogged the T127 and the team all the way through the 2010 season was about its identity. Was this truly a Lotus car? Many people felt that it wasn't a real Lotus, and the team had become quite sensitive to this. There was a lot of effort from the team to align itself with the history of Lotus. The team logo, for example, was clearly based on the famous Lotus logo, and in the garage they had one of Lotus founder Colin Chapman's caps to throw in the air in the unlikely event of any victory. Colin Chapman's son, Clive, asked Fernandez and the team about winning a Grand Prix. Would it be the first win for the new Lotus Racing team or the 80th win for Lotus as a whole? And Fernandez was clear on this point. This would be Lotus's 80th Grand Prix victory. He clearly saw this car as a Lotus. Gascoigne, who like Lotus was also from Norfolk, also felt that the car was a Lotus, saying that he felt it had to be green and yellow and it had to have a Lotus type number, and it had to be number 127, which was the next unallocated Lotus type number. Notably, Lotus never allotted that type number to any other project, so it does seem that the Type 127 should be considered a Lotus. Hazel Chapman, the widow of Colin Chapman, also visited the team at the British Grand Prix to see the team in operation, and she seemed to think it was a Lotus as well. However, things were beginning to get a bit tense between Lotus Racing and Group Lotus, the car company. During the 2010 season, Fernandez had hinted about the team racing in the famous black and gold JPS livery in 2011, and the management at Group Lotus was unhappy about this because they had something else in mind. Fernandez had also acquired the rights to the Team Lotus name and brand, something that Group Lotus believed that it still owned. Group Lotus then informed Fernandez that it no longer gave permission for Lotus Racing to use the Lotus brand in 2011, but Fernandez believed that he owned the Team Lotus brand and used it regardless. This ended up with the bizarre situation where in 2011, Team Lotus found itself racing against Lotus Renault Grand Prix in Formula 1, with both teams claiming to be the real Lotus in Formula 1. The matter ended up in court, and in early 2011, the courts decided that Group Lotus exclusively owned the rights to use the Lotus name on its own in Formula 1. The Team Lotus name, on the other hand, was able to be used by the Malaysian-owned team racing as Team Lotus. This slightly confusing judgment is perhaps part of the reason that some people still contend that the T127 was not a Lotus, although some of those same people believe that the Enstone built cars from 2012 to 2015, which were also entered as Lotuses, are also actual proper Lotuses. This is all very confusing, isn't it? So is the Type 127 a proper Lotus? It's hard to say conclusively, but one indicator that it is a proper Lotus is the fact that the type number was never reallocated, whereas the 2011 car built by Team Lotus, the Norfolk one, was given the T128, the Type 128 type number, which Group Lotus then allocated to a Le Mans prototype built in Germany. We'll have to get back to that, but the argument here is that the T128s, probably both of them, aren't really proper Lotuses, but one of them might be. It's up to you to work out which, whereas the T127, the 2010 car that this video is about, was always given and kept that exclusive Lotus chassis number. So I think that the T127 should appear in lists of Lotus cars, but maybe the T128s probably shouldn't. I'll leave it up to you to work out in the comments which one's a Lotus and which one's not. In the end, 4 T127 chassis were built, all of which raced at some point, and one of them remains in running condition, making appearances in the Boss GP Championship. Ultimately, even without all of the controversy, the Lotus T127 remains a remarkable Grand Prix car. From starting design work to having a running Grand Prix car in less than 5 months is truly an incredible feat, and one that should have set the team up for a very bright future, but we'll have to get back to that. If you've enjoyed this cost-capped tale of a largely forgotten Grand Prix car, then don't forget to hit like and subscribe, as there is a lot more like this to come. For now though, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon, somewhere in the pit lane.